disciples. This is the second part of the sermon from last week's message. And we must again name that there are intentional parallels and differences between the Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew, and the Sermon on the Plain from today's reading in Luke. And we name this because of our friend Herman. We haven't talked about our friend Herman in a while. Do you remember Herman? Herman, as in the big word, hermeneutics. That's one of those $1 words. Hermeneutics, I know, but it's an important word. Hermeneutics is what helps us interpret the biblical text faithfully as Christians. Hear that again. It's a big word. We can get stuck in it. Hermeneutics, or our friend Herman, is what helps us interpret the biblical text faithfully as Christians. Christian, meaning that we place Christ first to help us understand the best ways to share God's love. Thus, when we find ourselves struggling with the wide variety of stories and human experiences in the Bible, we refocus ourselves on God's love by understanding Jesus as the centering example. So today, we are right in the middle of a lot of Jesus' hermeneutics and understanding. We are in the middle of Jesus' insights, wisdom, challenges, and teachings. Matthew 5 and Luke 6 that we read today are crucial in understanding what it means to be a Christian and thus Christ-like. And this section is the heart of who we are called to be as people who proclaim loudly to love Christ and to be followers of Christ and to be Christians. This section of Luke is one of the places where the heart of who we are as followers of Christ in our everyday lives should be foundational to seek and understand how to follow God and embrace God's love of all creation. Jesus is preaching to the disciples one of those sermons for all sermons. It has nuance. It has hermeneutical connections to the Hebrew text. It has an awareness of cultural realities of Jesus' day, and it challenges everyone who is listening, including the disciples, to seek to live in God's love together. Now, last week we read at the beginning of Luke chapter 6 that everyone who was listening had been healed. Remember that? And then we moved in after that healing to that weird section, it's kind of difficult, of blessings and woes. And the blessings and woes, as we mentioned last week, can often divide us if we don't keep listening to the rest of the sermon. But Jesus, at the beginning of today's scripture reading, reminds us to listen. Jesus reminds the disciples to listen. And that the blessings and the woes are not where the message ends or stops. But what starts today's scripture? What is the word that begins today's scripture? It is the most biggest conjunction I think that has ever been written.
Most biggest.
But.
Makes sense.
But. And if you like big butts, and you cannot lie, this is the biggest B-U-T conjunction that has ever functioned in joining things together. So now those two songs that you probably already had stuck in your head Because this but, after those blessings and woes, B-U-T, brings us back together. And yet sometimes as we continue to read this next section, we find people who read it in a way that creates a type of passive portrayal of what's happening. We almost see it, or have been trained to see it, as ignoring wrongs, when in many ways this passage guides us to figure out how to really stand up to the woes of this world. It helps us see and create and understand there is an abundance of possibilities. Brendan Burchard says, humanity is seeing others and saying, I wish you joy, love, health, and abundance. Not just those you agree with, every single person. But Jesus says this type of thing first. Jesus says it in what we just heard today. Jesus provides a way to actually create abundance. And abundance is hard. Abundance, something the disciples are now experiencing due to their choice of leaving everything behind and following Jesus. This abundance of God and abundance of Jesus comes with this responsibility and their need to respond. And it isn't quite the type of abundance you expect initially. God's abundance isn't like human abundance. So turning the other cheek is not an act of ignoring. It is an act of saying, you may hurt one side of my face, but I will stand with my other unhurt side up to you and still be worthy and equal. I will not let you make me less than, and I will not experience you as more than. This is how those who heard this would interpret this concept of turning the other cheek, or giving your cloak away, as it may seem to us. Those who were listening would have heard it differently than we do. We often see it as an act of giving. But if you remember the story of Noah being seen without clothing, for the Jewish and Hebrew people, creates shame upon the person who may just keep asking and asking. So we may be asking people to face their shame and woes, or we may also be the ones who have to face our shame and woes ourselves. We may be the ones who turn the other cheek, or sometimes we must name we are the ones who hit first. Because the reality is everyone is someone else's enemy. And sometimes it is scarier to let one's enemy love us. And it is scarier to name that we might be the enemy, because then we may have to feel the shame. We may have to acknowledge that we need to give something up. And when we do, or sometimes when we don't, let us just be thankful for the next section in this sermon, where Jesus shares that God's love and grace is still greater than our shame and wrongdoings. God's love is an active pursuit of finding ways of what is balance for for things that are unfair, unjust, and does not bear good fruit. It does not mean that we ignore what is happening, but we stand up and we name it. It does not mean that we don't take time to recognize our sinfulness and shame in it, but instead we do. Where in the world are there people? Think about it. Where in the world are there people who are less than? Who are treated as unworthy? Who feel unlovable? Are we tending to those places in the garden? Where are places where God's creation is dying because of our actions? Where are places where we have abused our abundance and limited God's healing for one another? These are big questions. These are hard questions. Loving your enemy, realizing not to judge others, but being grateful that that means they aren't there to judge you. Being a true person who sees that God's love is abundant and wanting to make it abundant for all people is a difficult task to take. And just like the disciples, we now follow Christ and are the gardeners. And gardens, like farms or anything that grow, we know those things are fickle. They're hard. It's hard to keep it all in balance. The hard part is there are many ways to pay attention to it. And the good news is there are many ways to pay attention. There are many places that need love. And I kept going through all sorts of different examples of things we can do or actions we can take, but really you have to examine those for yourself. You have to be willing to faithfully look around and go, where am I the enemy? And where am I the friend? And it's not always intentional, it's just paying attention. But one of the places where we all can continue to help both here in our homes and close by, and also in our world, is through Week of Compassion. And so I want to share with you, as we close out today, Week of Compassion's video to remind us that love is ultimately the most abundant thing and what matters.